In a Foreign Town, in a Foreign Land, by Thomas Ligotti. 2. The bells will sound forever. I was sitting in a small park on a drab morning in early spring when a gentleman who looked as if he should be in a hospital sat down on the bench beside me. For a time, we both silently stared out at the colorless and soggy grounds of the park, where things were still thawing out and signs of a revived natural life remained only tentative, the bare branches of trees finely outlined against a gray sky. I had seen the other man on previous visits to the park, and when he introduced himself to me by name, I seemed to remember him as a businessman of some sort. The words commercial agent came to my mind as I sat gazing up at the thin dark branches and, beyond them, the gray sky. Somehow, our quiet and somewhat halting conversation touched upon a subject of a particular town near the northern border, a place where I once lived. "It's been many years," the other man said, "since I was last in that town." Then he proceeded to tell me about an experience he had had there in the days when he often traveled to remote locales for the business firm he represented, and which, until that time, he had served as a long-term and highly dedicated employee. It was late at night, he told me, and he needed a place to stay before moving on to his ultimate destination across the northern border. I knew, as a one-time resident of the town, that there were two principal venues where he might have spent the night. One of them was a lodging house on the west side of town that, in actuality, functioned primarily as a brothel patronized by traveling commercial agents. The other was located somewhere on the east side of town, in a district of once opulent, but now, for the most part, unoccupied houses, one of which, according to a rumor, had been converted into a hostel of some kind by an old woman named Mrs. Pick, who was reputed to have worked in various carnival sideshows, first as an exotic dancer, and then later as a fortune-teller, before settling in the northern border town. The commercial agent told me that he could not be sure if it was misdirection or deliberate mischief that sent him to the east side of town, where there were only a few lighted windows here and there. Thus, he easily spotted the vacancy sign that stood beside the steps leading up to an enormous house, which had a number of small turrets that seemed to sprout like so many warts across its facade, and even emerged from the high-peaked roof that crowned the structure. Despite the grim appearance of the house, a miniature ruined castle, as my companion in the park expressed it, not to mention the generally desolate character of the surrounding neighborhood, the commercial agent said that he was not for a moment deterred from ascending the porch steps. He pressed the doorbell, which he said was a buzzer-type bell, as opposed to the type that chimed or told its signal. However, in addition to the buzzing noise that was made when he pressed the button for the doorbell, he claimed that there was also a jingle-jangle sound similar to that of sleigh bells. When the door finally opened and the commercial agent confronted the heavily made-up face of Mrs. Pick, He simply asked, "Do you have a room?" Upon entering the vestibule to the house, he was made to pause by Mrs. Pick, who gestured with a thin and palsied hand toward the registration ledger, which was spread open on a lectern in the corner. There were no other visitors listed on the pages before him, yet the commercial agent unhesitatingly picked up the fountain pen that lay in the crux of the ledger book and signed his name, Q. H. Crum. Having done this, he turned back toward Mrs. Pick and stooped down to retrieve the small suitcase he had brought in with him. At that moment, he first saw Mrs. Pick's left hand, the non-palsied hand, which was just as thin as the other, but which appeared to be a prosthetic device resembling the pale hand of an old mannequin, its enameled epidermis having flaked away in several places. It was then that Mr. Crum fully realized, in his own words, the deliriously preposterous position in which he had placed himself. Yet, he said that he also felt a great sense of excitation relating to things which he could not precisely name, things which he had never imagined before, and which, it seemed, were not even possible for him to imagine with any clarity at that time. The old woman was aware that Crum had taken note of her artificial hand. "As you can see," she said, in a slow and raspy voice, "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, no matter what some fool tries to pull on me. But I don't receive as many gentlemen travelers as I once did. I'm sure I wouldn't have any at all if it were up to certain people," she finished. Deliriously preposterous, Mr. Crum thought to himself. Nevertheless, he followed Mrs. Pick like a little dog when she guided him into her house, which was so poorly lighted that one was at a loss to distinguish any features of the decor, leaving Crum with the heady sensation of being enveloped by the most sumptuous surroundings of shadows. This feeling was only intensified when the old woman reached out for a small lamp that was barely glowing in the darkness, and, with a flick of her real hand, turned up its wick, the light pushing back some of the shadows, while grotesquely enlarging many others. She then began escorting Crum up the stairs to his room, holding the lamp in her real hand, while simply allowing her artificial hand to hang at her side. And with each step that Mrs. Pick ascended, the commercial agent seemed to detect the same jingle-jangle of bells that he had first heard when he was standing outside the house, waiting for someone to answer his ring. But the sound was so faint, as if heavily muffled, that Mr. Crum willingly believed it to be only the echo of a memory, or his wandering imagination. The room in which Mrs. Pick finally deposited her guest was on the highest floor of the house, just down a short, narrow hallway from the door leading to the attic. By that time, there seemed nothing at all preposterous in this arrangement, Mr. Crum told me, as we sat together on the park bench, looking out at that drab morning in early spring. I replied that such lapses in judgment were not uncommon where Mrs. Pick's lodging-house was concerned. At least, such were the rumors I had heard during the period when I was living in the town near the northern border. When they had reached the hallway of the highest floor of the house, Crum informed me, Mrs. Pick set aside the lamp she was carrying on a table positioned near the top of the last flight of stairs. She then extended her hand and pushed a small button that protruded from one of the walls, thereby activating some lighting fixtures along either wall. The illumination remained dismal, actively dismal, as Crum described it, but served to reveal the densely patterned wallpaper and the even more densely patterned carpeting of the hallway, which led, in one direction, to the opening onto the attic, and, in the other direction, to the room in which the commercial agent was supposed to sleep that night. After Mrs. Pick unlocked the door to this room and pushed another small button upon the wall inside, Crum observed how cramped and austere was the chamber in which he was being placed. Unnecessarily so, he thought, considering the apparent spaciousness, or dark sumptuousness, as he called it, of the rest of the house. Yet Crum made no objection, nor felt any, he insisted, and with mute obedience he set his suitcase down beside a tiny bed, which was not even equipped with a headboard. "There's a bathroom just a little way down the hall," Mrs. Pick said, before she left the room, closing the door behind her. And in the silence of that little room, Crum thought that once again he could hear the jingle-jangle sound of bells fading into the distance and the darkness of that great house. Although he had put in quite a long day, the commercial agent did not feel in the least bit tired, or possibly he had entered into a mental state beyond the boundaries of absolute fatigue, as he himself speculated when we were sitting on that bench in the park. For some time he lay on the undersized bed, still fully clothed, and stared at a ceiling that had several large stains spread across it. After all, he thought, he had been placed in a room that was directly below the roof of the house, and apparently this roof was damaged in some way, which allowed the rain to freely enter through the attic on stormy days and nights. Suddenly, his mind became fixed in the strangest way upon the attic, the door to which was just down the hall from his own room. "The mystery of an old attic," Crum whispered to himself as he lay on that miniature bed in a room at the top of an enormous house of enveloping shadows. Feelings and impulses that he had never experienced before arose in him as he became more and more excited about the attic and its mysteries. He was a traveling commercial agent who needed his rest to prepare himself for the next day, and yet all he could think about was getting up from his bed and walking down the dimly lighted hallway toward that door leading to the attic of Mrs. Pick's shadowy house. He could tell anyone who cared to know that he was only going down the hall to use the bathroom, he told himself. But Crum proceeded past the door to the bathroom, and soon found himself helplessly creeping into the attic, the door to which had been left unlocked. The air inside smelled sweet and stale. Moonlight entered by way of a small octagonal window and guided the commercial agent among the black clutter toward a light bulb that hung down from a thick black cord. He reached up and turned a little dial that protruded from the side of the light bulb fixture. Now he could see the treasures surrounding him, and he was shaking with the excitation of his discovery. Crumb told me that Mrs. Pick's old attic was like a costume shop or the dressing room of a theater. All around him was a world of strange outfits spilling forth from the depths of large open trunks or dangling in the shadows of tall open wardrobes. Later, he became aware that these curious clothes were, for the most part, remnants from Mrs. Pick's days as an exotic dancer and subsequently a fortune-teller for various carnival sideshows. Crumb himself remembered observing that mounted along the walls of the attic were several faded posters advertising the two distinct phases of the old woman's former life. One of these posters portrayed a dancing girl posed in mid-turn amidst a whirl of silks, her face averted from the silhouetted heads representing the audience at the bottom of the picture, a mob of bald pates and bowler hats huddled together. Another poster displayed a pair of dark, staring eyes with long, spidery lashes. Above the eyes, printed in a serpentine style of lettering, were the words, "Mistress of Fortune." Below the eyes, spelled in the same type of letters, was a simple question: "What is your will?" Aside from the leftover garments of an exotic dancer or a mysterious fortune-teller, there were also other clothes, other costumes. They were scattered all over the attic, that paradise of the past, as Crumb began to refer to it. His hands trembled as he found all sorts of odd disguises lying about the floor or draped across a wardrobe mirror, elaborate and clownish outfits in rich velvets and shiny, colorful satins. Rummaging among this delirious attic world, Crumb finally found what he barely knew he was seeking. There it was, buried at the bottom of one of the largest trunks, a fool's motley, complete with soft slippers turned up at the toes, and a two-pronged cap that jangled its bells as he pulled it over his head. The entire suit was a mad patchwork of colored fabrics and fitted him perfectly once he had removed all of the clothes he wore as a commercial agent. The double peaks of the fool's cap resembled the twin horns of a snail, Crumb noticed when he looked at his image in the mirror, except that they drooped this way and that whenever he shook his head to make the bells jangle. There were also bells sewn into the turned-up tips of the slippers and hanging here and there upon the body of the jester's suit. Crumb made them all go jingle-jangle, he explained to me, as he pranced before the wardrobe mirror, gazing upon the figure that he could not recognize as himself. So lost he was in a world of feelings and impulses he had never before imagined. He no longer retained the slightest sense, he said, of his existence as a traveling commercial agent. For him, there was now only the jester's suit hugging his body, the jingle-jangle of the bells, and the slack face of a fool in the mirror. After a time, he sank face down upon the cold wooden floor of the attic, Crum informed me, and lay absolutely still, exhausted by the contentment he had found in that musty paradise. Then the sound of the bells started up again, although Crum could not tell from where it was coming. His body remained unmoving on the floor in a state of sleepy paralysis, and yet he heard the sound of the jangling bells. Crum thought that if he could just open his eyes and roll over on the floor, he could see what was making the sound of the bells. But soon he lost all confidence in this plan of action, because he could no longer feel his own body. The sound of the bells became even louder, jangling about his ears, even though he was incapable of making his head move in any way, and thus shaking the bells on his two-pronged fool's cap. Then he heard a voice say to him, "Open your eyes and see your surprise." And when he opened his eyes, he finally saw his face in the wardrobe mirror. It was a tiny face on a tiny fool's head, and the head was at the end of a stick, a kind of baton with stripes on it, like a candy cane, held in the wooden hand of Mrs. Pick. She was shaking the striped stick like a baby's rattle, making the bells on Crum's tiny head go jingle-jangle so wildly. There, in the mirror, he could also see his body lying helpless and immobile upon the attic floor. And in his mind was a single consuming thought: to be a head on a stick, held in the wooden hand of Mrs. Pick, forever, forever. When Crum awoke the next morning, he heard the sound of raindrops on the roof just above the room in which he lay fully clothed on the bed. Mrs. Pick was shaking him gently with her real hand, saying, "Wake up, Mr. Crum. It's late, and you have to be on your way. You have business across the border." Crum wanted to say something to the old woman then and there, confront her with what he had described to me as his adventure in the attic. But Mrs. Pick's brusque, business-like manner and her entirely ordinary tone of voice told him that any inquiries would be useless. In any case, he was afraid that openly bringing up this particular matter with Mrs. Pick was not something he should do if he wished to remain on good terms with her. Soon thereafter, he was standing with his suitcase in his hand at the door of the enormous house, lingering for a moment to gaze upon the heavily made-up face of Mrs. Pick and secure another glimpse of the artificial hand which hung down at her side. "May I come to stay again?" Crum asked. "If you wish," answered Mrs. Pick, as she held open the door for her departing guest. Once he was outside on the porch, Crum quickly turned about face and called out, "May I have the same room?" But Mrs. Pick had already closed the door behind him, and her answer to his question, if it actually was one, was a faint jingle-jangle sound of tiny bells. After consummating his commercial dealings on the other side of the northern border, Mr. Crum returned to the location of Mrs. Pick's house. only to find that the place had been burned to the ground during the brief interval that he had been away. I told him, as we sat on that park bench, looking out upon a drab morning in early spring, that there had always been rumors, a sort of irresponsible twilight talk, about Mrs. Pick and her old house. Some persons, hysterics of one sort or another, suggested that Mrs. Glim, who operated the lodging house on the west side of town, was the one behind the fire which brought an end to Mrs. Pick's activities on the east side. The two of them had apparently been associates at one time, in a sense partners, whose respective houses on the west and east sides of the northern border town were operated for the mutual benefit of both women. But a rift of some kind appeared to turn them into bitter enemies. Mrs. Glim, who was sometimes characterized as a person of uncanny greed, became intolerant of the competition posed by her former ally in business. It came to be understood throughout the town near the northern border that Mrs. Glim had arranged for someone to assault Mrs. Pick in her own house, an attack which culminated in the severing of Mrs. Pick's left hand. However, Mrs. Glim's plan to discourage the ambitions of her competitor ultimately backfired, it seemed, for after this attack on her person, Mrs. Pick appeared to undergo a dramatic change, as did her method of running things at her East Side house. She had always been known as a woman of exceptional will and extraordinary gifts, this one-time exotic dancer, and later mistress of fortune. But following the dismemberment of her left hand and its replacement by an artificial wooden hand, she seemed to have attained unheard-of powers, all of which she directed toward one aim, that of putting her ex-partner, Mrs. Glim, out of business. It was then that she began to operate her lodging house in an entirely new manner and in accordance with unique methods, so that whenever a traveling commercial agent who patronized Mrs. Glim's West Side lodging house came to stay at Mrs. Pick's, he always returned to Mrs. Pick's house on the East Side, and never again to Mrs. Glim's West Side place. I mentioned to Crum that I had lived in that northern border town long enough to have been told on various occasions that a guest could visit Mrs. Pick just so many times before he discovered one day that he could never leave her again. Such talk, I continued, was to some extent substantiated by what was found in the ruins of Mrs. Pick's house after the fire. It seemed that there were rooms all over the house, and even in the farthest corners of its vast cellar regions, where the charred remains of human bodies were found. To all appearances, given the intensely destructive nature of that conflagration, each of the incinerated corpses was dressed in some outlandish clothing, as if the whole structure of the house were inhabited by a nest of masqueraders. In light of all the stories we had heard in the town, no one bothered to remark on how unlikely it was, how preposterous even, that none of the lodgers at Mrs. Pick's house had managed to escape. Nevertheless, as I disclosed to Crum, the body of Mrs. Pick herself was never found, despite a most diligent search that was conducted by Mrs. Glim. Yet even as I brought all of these facts to his attention as we sat on that park bench, Crumb's mind seemed to have drifted off to other realms, and more than ever, he looked as if he belonged in a hospital. Finally, he spoke, asking me to confirm what I had said about the absence of Mrs. Pick's body among those found in the ashes left by the fire. I confirmed the statement I had made, begging him to consider the place and the circumstances which were the source of this and all my other remarks, as well as his own, that were made that morning in early spring. "Remember your own words," I said to Crumb. "Which words were those?" he asked. "Deliriously preposterous," I said, trying to draw out the sound of each syllable, as if to imbue them with some actual sense, or at least a dramatic force of some kind. "You were only a pawn," I said. "You and all those others were nothing but pawns in a struggle between forces you could not conceive. Your impulses were not your own. They were as artificial as Mrs. Pick's wooden hand." For a moment, Crumb seemed to become roused to his senses. Then he said, as if to himself, "They never found her body." "No, they did not," I answered. "Not even her hand," he said, in a strictly rhetorical tone of voice. Again I affirmed his statement. Crumb fell silent after that juncture in our conversation, and when I left him that morning, he was staring out at the drab and soggy grounds of that park with the look of someone in a hysterical trance, remaining quietly attentive for some sound or sign to reach his awareness. That was the last time I saw him. Occasionally, on nights when I find it difficult to sleep, I think about Mr. Crumb, the commercial agent, and the conversation we had that day in the park. I also think about Mrs. Pick and her house on the east side of a northern border town where I once lived. In these moments, it is almost as if I myself can hear the faint jingle-jangle of bells in the blackness, and my mind begins to wander in pursuit of a desperate dream that is not my own. Perhaps this dream ultimately belongs to no one, however many persons, including commercial agents, may have belonged to it.